Okay, just as a matter of review, the French Revolution obviously radically changes French politics. There are some historians of the French Revolution, or even political theorists, that will say, right, that essentially the French Revolution is really, it's a civil war that begins in France in 1789, and it continues until 1906 or 1911, when there's finally a decisive constitution that's clearly like the secularized constitution of France, and that's essentially been French society since 1911 or so. And you can see, well, I think you can see in the 19th century, there's all sorts of back and forth between the Royalists, the radical Jacobins, who they give themselves new names at one point or another. There's an archbishop and during one of the revolutions of the 1830s, and the shenanigans going back and forth between these two groups, there's an archbishop that tries to mediate between the two of them, and he gets assassinated by a Jacobin for trying to be a mediator, right? So after Napoleon goes down in 1815, or finally after he goes down in Waterloo in 1818, there's still a lot of people, there's still a lot of figures that continue with the ideas or the ideals of the pre-revolution. Now, by the time Napoleon goes down, the Enlightenment and administrative bureaucracy is in place. For example, and that's pretty much stays consistent through the various regimes. Now, obviously, there's an attempt to restore the monarchy at some point, and this leads to a lot of. It's really interesting, actually, and just as we saw during the French Revolution, usually when they somehow expand the electorate, monarchy tends to win. And so, if they want to push either the liberal or the moderate liberal Enlightenment or the radical liberal Enlightenment, they usually have to do some sort of restricting of the electorate throughout the 19th century. But there's a lot of jostling back and forth. There's something that people say about revolutions. All revolutions end up at some point in civil wars between the factions that carry out the revolutions. If you take a course on revolutions as a political philosophy course, that's usually one of the conclusions, right? That eventually the factions that bring about the revolution usually end up fighting a civil war with each other. So, just to say, I want to say now a few things about the political situation, and then I want to deal in particular with Romanticism and some of its consequences. So first of all, about the political situation in Europe. I would say the first biggest point, and this concerns the international order, that at the Congress of Vienna, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it's funny, Talleyrand, who was part of both the revolutionary governments of the 1790s, he was part of Napoleon's government. He was Napoleon's secretary, equivalent of Napoleon's Secretary of State. And so at the Congress of Vienna, they didn't want anybody from Napoleon's government, right, to be representing France. But at the same time, they didn't think through who was going to represent France. So literally, the Talleyrand pulled off stuff I've done. I've seen people do at Notre Dame football games, right? He just showed up at the procession, and when they were marching in, like when the band was marching in to the Congress of Vienna to play the first, opening whatever quartet with all the other diplomats, he just walked in as the French diplomat, and he became the French diplomat at the Congress of Vienna. He was respected enough to where in the sense of he was a very smart man, and he was always very pragmatic, so they let him be France's representative at the Congress of Vienna. Essentially, I think as far as the international order, the big move, the big personage at the Congress of Vienna was Metternich, right, of Austria. And his idea was that we don't want any great wars again in Europe, like the Napoleonic Wars, right? And the way we're going to prevent that from happening is we're going to basically say there's great powers and there's small powers, right? And the great powers, they have an obligation, they have kind of responsibility to kind of work out how to organize Europe, and then by this point, how to organize the world, as far as colonies and whatnot. And yes, there will still be competition, and sometimes they might be jockeying with each other, because I think Metternich basically saw in the previous century, you had kind of everybody going after their colonies, and there was really there was very little diplomatic efforts to ever mediate conflicts either within Europe or in the colonies. So Metternich's idea was, let's just admit it. There's great powers and there's small powers, right? And the small powers got to suck it up and more or less do what the great powers want. And there's going to be probably competition for the colonies, because he said Austria and Hungary are not really interested in colonies. We're kind of happy with our little empire here in Central Europe. But we have to set up a diplomacy by which we can mediate some of these disputes over the colonies. Now, and this became kind of the order, this became kind of the balance of power, the balance of powers, the order of Europe, and it more or less worked. Really, it worked up until the First World War, and the reason it failed, you could say, is that as of 1815, even though Prussia had a really terrific army, they weren't considered a great power, because they were still a very small state. But between 1815 and 1870, Prussia unites all of the German states into one state, Germany, which then wants to become a great power. And Britain doesn't want to have that happen, right? So that kind of conflict that leads to the First World War. Question?
Could you put that guy's name on the board? How do you spell him?
And the other name was that Talleyrand?
Talleyrand.
Talleyrand. Okay.
I think Hilaire Belloc has a biography of Talleyrand, which is, it's like, you wouldn't read his biography like to learn how to live your life from the standpoint of faithfulness to your vocation or something like that. But he is a kind of fascinating figure. He was kind of a genius. And on his deathbed, he came back to the church, right? And the guy that went to anoint him, the priest that went to do the anointing, was doing it wrong. And he corrected the guy. And so he hadn't done any sacraments maybe ever. Talleyrand.
He was
right?
a bishop, though.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you had to confect the sacraments in those days. I don't mean to shock you, but yeah.
Was he ordained a priest?
Yeah, he was ordained a bishop and he was made a cardinal. But it's not clear if he ever actually celebrated. Well, he did celebrate some masses, like of the cult of reason and of the cult of theophilanthropy during the French Revolution. Yeah, he did. But anyway, on his deathbed, when they went to anoint him, he started correcting the guy. So you got to anoint me properly, and told the guy what to say.
Wow.
Right.
Wow. It says here he also signed in the priest's presence a solemn declaration in which he openly disavowed, quote, the great errors which had troubled and afflicted the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church, and in which he himself had the misfortune to fall.
That's right.
He went straight to heaven.
That's right. He probably got the apostolic blessing, which is a plenary indulgence at the moment of death.
What?
Let that be a lesson for you. Confess at the end.
So another point to I think this is important for understanding both Spain and Latin America. Okay, on the one, you got to remember, eventually Napoleon takes over Spain. he kicks out both Ferdinand VII and his potential successor. He also takes over Portugal. There's an interesting little side note also. The monarchy of Portugal moved to Brazil. Right? It's a little fascinating thing of history that for a chunk of time during the Napoleonic era, the monarchy of Portugal was actually functioning in Brazil, which creates all sorts of interesting historical notes for Brazil and political notes. But I think essentially the thing to understand is that, right, when Napoleon basically kicks out Ferdinand VII, essentially Latin America at this point becomes a kind of chaos. Right, the religious orders are gone. And now the colonial administration is gone. The colonial administration was probably a bunch of, just common sense naturalists. And the bishops who were their craven slaves, right?
So what does this have to do with Ferdinand's expulsion? Because
I'm about to explain that, yeah. So, but when he's expelled, even that little which is left, it kind of falls apart, right? And so what you have now in Latin America at this point, in the various provinces, what you have are these juntas, these rulers of 5 men, and they're basically a mishmash of whatever crazy ideas are out there at the time, right? And the natural Enlightenment figures. People who admire Napoleon because he's just a general that wins, right? Members of the radical Enlightenment. Some people that are, more or less. Sometimes there's like a lone Catholic that'll get on the junta who's a practicing Catholic. Masons, a lot of Masons are already in Latin America at this point. And by the way, the junta, the ruler of 5, that a lot of the forms of government in France, in the French Revolution, and the way they worked the bureaucracy, they all got it. They got it from Masonic gematria, right? That somehow 5 was a mystical number. So that's why there's 5 in the Directorate of France, right? Or the hexagon was a big number, so they tried to organize France according to the hexagon. There's all sorts of ways they're using stuff from their Masonic lodges, the numerology, the gematria, because they think it means something. Right, so you get the ruler. This is why you get the rulers of 5, the junta, the military junta. You also just get military figures that join these juntas. And basically, I think this helps understand, right, Latin America from really this time to this day is just these competing factions, competing for the various governments of the various places. Sometimes, for a little bit of time, Napoleon III will send his troops into Mexico to try to take it from the Spaniards. But it's really a chaotic situation. The same thing happens in Spain. In Spain, the juntas start organizing almost like a counter-government to the rule of Napoleon in Spain. And at one point, the juntas, they go to Cadiz. And in 1812, they write a liberal Enlightenment constitution, the Constitution of Cadiz. And this becomes like a point of reference for Spanish politics hereafter. This liberal constitution. And again, it's written by Masons, naturalists, followers of John Locke or Rousseau, or maybe even radical followers of Diderot or the Whigs in Britain, right? When eventually in 1814, Napoleon lets Ferdinand VII come back to Spain and to rule, kind of as figurehead king. Ferdinand is able to kind of unite everybody under himself, under anti-French hatred. Because Napoleon's troops, whether they were in Italy or France, they weren't like the best gentlemen in the world. No, because the army was made up of like a lot of criminals and people who were the enragés that didn't get guillotined, got sent to the army. right? So when Ferdinand XIV comes back in 1814, the first thing he does is he denounces the Constitution of Cadiz as being illegitimate, unlawful, and hopefully never to be seen again in Spain.
So, probably Jeff.
Yes.
So those juntas, were they set up by the French rulers?
No,
or
the
they
juntas
just-
were set up by, like, you know, if the Canadians taken over Indiana and Michigan, and we were the people just left here, and we wanted to resist the Canadians, right? We would just organize amongst ourselves and say, you're in charge, right? You and Joe Archer and Nick and Peter and Michael, you guys are in charge. You're the junta, right?
And so
You're the
this-
junta, and they would organize the army and they would organize the guerrilla warfare against the French army.
So
There
it
was-
was like a resistance.
Yeah, but it also tried to be a government at the same time.
Well, Jeff, can I ask a question as well?
Yeah.
You mentioned the Jesuits were out of Latin America at this point, or?
Yep.
And that was because they've been getting attacked.
That's because when they were expelled from Spain, Spain controlled Latin America, so they had to leave Latin America.
When basically the Vatican revoked their.
Well, before the Vatican suppressed the Jesuits, they were first expelled from France and Spain,
Okay.
and then there was pressure put on the Pope, so that the Pope would suppress them everywhere, and then they were expelled everywhere else, except for Prussia and Catherine the Great, and Russia. Basically, Prussia and Russia, when they saw the Jesuits getting expelled, their attitude was, wait, we're trying to build up a high school system. All these awesome educators are getting kicked out of everywhere else in the world. We'll take them. So they refused to, in those days, even any papal decree, for it to go into effect, the state had to actually promulgate it. Right? So Catherine the Great and Frederick, whatever Frederick it was, they just refused to promulgate it, so that all the Jesuits could kind of run into those countries and build up their high school and university systems.
Didn't the Russians end up hating the Jesuits though as well?
Well, in their literature, yes. I mean, everybody hates the Jesuits, right? I mean, in the 19th century, right? I mean, they become like easy targets in every country's literature.
Doesn't Zosima trash them?
Yeah, yeah. And so does Alyosha's brother
Yeah.
in
The
the
United States also allowed.
in the Grand Inquisitor. Well, at first, no. I mean, we might have, but I don't think many came. If we did,
Sure.
because I think we still had we had like tenuous. Well, no, the church was just starting in the States, and we hadn't signed any concordance at that point.
Right.
But I think it was easier for them to get to, like, to get to the States, they'd have to kind of get to English ships, and they weren't exactly like
Well, like
welcomed in the British, among the British in the 1770s. So we also mentioned in the previous class, right? Many of the cardinals in the church, they divide in the Politicanti and the Zelanti. During the French Revolution, in France, in Germany, in Italy, you start to see, obviously, a reaction against Napoleon, against the Enlightenment. And you also, I mean, and it's interesting, I think in a lot of, and this is what matures or develops into Romanticism. Okay? And what I want to do now in this class is I'm basically going to be describing things that take place between 1800 and 1830. The exact dates are not essential. But I want to describe a number of things that happen as far as the movement of ideas. So, first of all, there's several things that give rise to Romanticism. One is simply just the brutality of the Napoleonic troops, and the typical reasons. The typical reasons now you see people rebelling against Brussels, in the EU, right? Napoleon and his advisors were trying to establish an administrative bureaucracy that would govern everything according to Enlightenment principles. And that doesn't always make people happy. Germany was reduced. Germany had over 100 prince-bishop principalities, many of which were run by bishops. I mean, the bishops exercised both temporal and spiritual power in these German principalities, right? After the Congress of Vienna, even the people at the Congress of Vienna, they took all these different principalities and they reduced them to 39. And so I think the book I was reading, I think either what was interesting about what happened to Catholics in Germany at this point is I think there was only one province of the 39, or maybe two, where Catholics were in a majority. It's almost as if the provinces were gerrymandered so that the Catholics would be in a minority in every province.
This is when France takes over Germany?
No, this would be the Congress of Vienna.
Oh.
I think that's one of the instances though where they followed the French reorganization of Germany in doing this. Right? So another feature is that there's a lot of controversy in European intellectual circles over the British system. So, for example, the followers of Kant want nothing to do with the British system. They have nothing but suspicion for the British system. Though the ideas of Edmund Burke, for example, are very popular in Germany in the early, after 1800. So, but you could say that what happens at this point is that you get the rise of different forms of romanticism, right? And what is a romanticist? Basically, it's someone that says, I'm not happy with the way things are now, and I'm going to look in somehow if I look, a lot of romantics were first followers of Rousseau. And the basic movement was if I look deep enough into my inner feelings, into my consciousness. In other words, like Rousseau, I think Rousseau wouldn't. I mean, you could easily make a joke out of Rousseau. You could say, I'm walking by a hot dog stand in New York, and I look into my deep inner feelings, and I just have to have the hot dog, right? But that's not. I mean, it's not exactly what Rousseau. I mean, I guess Rousseau would say that's not what he meant, right? Nor would a typical romantic. But what happens is that some romantics they look into they start looking into the past of their country. They say, I'm going to find in the past of my country something that's going to give meaning to my deep feelings, my deep emotions. And that will give me meaning in life. Now, not all, it's important, I think, also to remember that a lot of romantics are also reacting against the Enlightenment. They see the Enlightenment as being excessively, kind of superficially natural, just based on superficial sense perceptions. And they say basically, somehow, if I can look deep into my nature, deep into my feelings, my emotions, I might discover something that's beautiful and true. But I'm not going to do that if I stay on the level of empiricism, or sense perceptions, or the morality of sentiments, right? And certainly skepticism is not going to get me anywhere. Some romanticists who set out on this effort, they look so deeply into themselves, and they see so many conflicts, so many conflicting feelings, emotions, and sentiments, that they start proposing nihilism and suicide. Right? Because if you just can't make sense out of it all, you might as well just end it all. And then there's other romantics. Yes.
You mentioned the ideas of Edmund Burke.
Yes.
Who's that?
Edmund Burke was a Whig, a British Whig, who was part of the radical Whig party in Britain, but during the time of the French Revolution, becomes a deep critic of it, and he writes a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is a critique of the French Revolution. And he becomes kind of a figurehead for those who are critics of the French Revolution in the English-speaking world. Yes?
Is Nietzsche an example of these?
Yeah, I think down the road, Nietzsche would be an example like this, yeah. So among these critics of the French Revolution, you start to get some who basically say, look, if we look into the past of our countries, especially in Europe, and if we're really honest about all the data, what we discover is Catholicism.
Wow.
Right? And not only that, what we discover is that what's happened in Europe in the last 200 or 300 years is actually a rejection of Catholicism. It's a rejection of an entire order, and all the principles that could guide an order. And so, if we actually look at all the data, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go back into the past. Not just for the purpose of going back into the past, because the Romantics were all about, once you looked into your past deep enough, you got to build a better society. But we're going to go back into the past in order to try to use our intelligence to create something that's true and beautiful again. And if we look back into the past, we're probably going to find things that were tossed aside or neglected that shouldn't have been tossed aside or neglected in the last 200 years. By the way, just as I have a modern example of this in Estonia. In 2009, I got a call from Father Farrell Peternal, who's the numerary priest in Estonia, and he asked me if I knew anybody that would like going to a. He was in Lithuania, but he asked me if I knew anyone that would like going to a conference in Estonia. And I asked around to my colleagues, and nobody was interested in going. So I told Father Farrell, I said, well, no one's interested in going, but I'll go, right? So I went, and actually the people there was this group, they call themselves Trilogos. Trilogos. So, and how did this group come about? Well, in the 1970s in Estonia, there's this great classical composer, Arvo Pärt, or Ivo Part, or something like that. Pärt. Anyway, well, his buddy is a guy named Taivo, Estonian last name, I can't remember. Right? And Taivo was basically like a rock musician, like a popular rock musician in Estonia in the 70s. And he woke up one day and he said, my country is ugly. There's nothing beautiful in my country except for this one street in Tallinn, the capital. So I got to figure out why this street is beautiful. So he did research, and he discovered, well, this street is beautiful because it's the last street that hasn't been destroyed from 12th and 13th century Estonia. And he discovered that back in that time, Estonia was called Mary's Land. And he started discovering it had this beautiful architecture. It had a beautiful tradition of painting. And that basically he realized that after the beginning in the 1500s, that's when ugliness began in Estonia. So he converted to Catholicism. And then about 800 people followed him.
Wow.
Because he was like a rock musician. So the church in Estonia at that point went from 200 to 800. Right? And then they all became Catholic. They lived as Catholics. They had big families.
Wow.
And then in the 90s, what happened is they used EU funds for restoring historical culture, right? Because that's the game you got to play in Europe. So they used EU funds for restoring historical culture to buy back the cathedral, buy back 2 or 3 blocks of the city. They built workshops for workers. They built glass production shops. They built the theater. They built the music hall. They bought back the old Dominican monastery, and we used part of that monastery for this actual conference. They started a choir, like a boys' choir. They built a Catholic school, St. Michael's Academy, and they made it the elite top school in the country. So all the Catholics in the city go there. And that's still only 10% of the population. And the rest of the school is all the artists of the country, all the musicians, all the politicians. They all send their kids to St. Michael's, right? And then when the work went to Estonia, 2 or 3 of the members of the work became teachers in that school.
Wow.
And the priest became like the chaplain of the school. Well, you got to understand, when the work went to Estonia, they doubled the number of priests in the country from 3 to 6. Right? So, but I think that's an example of, he's an example of like a romantic. Right? He was kind of a musician. He looked into his past. He discovered. But then also he did something about it. Right? He did what was possible using EU funds. So you start to get reflections also on the and a lot of the first Romantics, and then in the Catholic world especially, they're reflecting on what caused the French Revolution, right? So one book that comes out, which is actually, it's a delightful book to read. If the Abbé Barruel, he was a guy who was a Jesuit. When the Jesuits got suppressed, he became just a normal priest. But he loved to collect documents. So Abbé Barruel writes this book on the cause of the French Revolution. And actually a lot of his research is pretty good, even though modern historians you might have to verify it, and modern historians will give you a hard time about it. But he basically goes in and he shows how, there was this guy, Adam Weishaupt, in Germany. He formed a group called the Illuminati. There were the Masonic lodges. There was also the Republic of Letters, and the leader of the Republic of Letters was Voltaire. And he finds all this correspondence between Voltaire and all of his various followers throughout Europe. He goes through the whole thing of how how Voltaire and his associates planned the suppression of the Jesuits, how they went to the Pope, how they got the Bourbons. I mean, he kind of goes through, paints the whole picture. And so it's kind of a delightful. I enjoyed reading it when I was in grad school. So he shows kind of a lot of what he shows is the beginning of how propaganda was used, right? How the Republic of Letters, which was a minority, was able to make itself seem much bigger part of the population than it really was. He showed essentially that there was kind of a culture war that was going on in France that a lot of the Catholics didn't seem fully aware of in the 1750s and 60s. Why? Because they were befriending people like Voltaire, who they didn't know at the time was their enemy, conspiring against them. So there's this one French fellow, Joseph de Maistre. He was a noble and somewhat of an intellectual. He was also a faithful Catholic. So at one point during the French Revolution, he fled to Russia. He fled to Holy Mother Russia. And de Maistre writes a book. He's a great political philosopher in my mind. He writes a book called Du Pape. And if he were to comment on Barruel, I think he would say something like this. Barruel, what he says is true. Much of what he says is true and interesting, and it's important to account for. Like, for example, the fact that, we should be more wary of people who say that they're representatives of the modern Enlightenment from here on out. Why? Because when you look at the history now, it's clear, right, that there's people like Voltaire. The only reason he prided himself, one of the reasons he wanted to be modern Enlightenment is because he just thought it's a better way of getting rid of the church is just chipping away at it piece by piece, rather than just an open, violent revolution. And to some degree, Voltaire was right, because during the French Revolution, the prestige of the papacy went from like 0 to, by the time you get to the end of by the time you get to 1820, Pius VII, his prestige is just skyrocketing, right? They were calling Pius VI Pius the Last. Even if you look at the letters of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, right? They're going back and forth about the papacy in some of their letters, and they're like, oh yeah, in 50 years there won't be Catholicism anymore. Because the Pope is such a pathetic figure, right? Neither of them had much love for the Catholic Church, at least in their correspondence. Pardon? Jefferson and Adams. Adams. The one we're all supposed to adulate now, Adams.
Jefferson was a slave owner.
Well, he had. I mean, Jefferson. Yeah, but also Jefferson. No, Jefferson. Like one of his last public speeches, like a few days before he died, right? He says, "The American Revolution is the revolution that will show once and for all that we no longer have to live under the chains of monkish ignorance." You know.
Where Craig went undergrad.
So.
Hey, we've got
But
a
de Maistre-
Priory there now. So.
Yeah, we're taking over.
Come back.
Harvard is ours. It's going to be ours. It's going to be the first university to work in this country.
Bold.
With Adrian Vermeil on our side,
Yeah.
how could we go wrong?
There won't be a country.
So anyway, so de Maistre, his argument is that Barruel's book is true and important, but it doesn't go far enough. We have to admit, if we really reflect on things, that at least going back to the Protestant Reformation, and if not before, if you follow the school of nominalism, for example, there have been a lot of bad ideas, right? There have been a lot of bad ideas about the human person, and there have been a lot of bad ideas about the state and the nature of the state that have infected Europe, its political life, its social life, and its economic life since that time. These are like seeds that were planted 300-400 years ago, and these seeds have now borne their rotten fruit. Okay? So, and what these seeds have done is that they've eliminated respect for genuine, lawful authority that can be exercised not only by the state, but also by intermediate bodies, beginning with the church. Right? And these intermediate bodies, they are important bodies because they are composed of logos-drenched authority. Right? And the state, the modern state that's been built up after the French Revolution, it's been built up as Napoleon defined it when he defined the amalgam, right? As like a massive weight of granite. And it's a massive weight of granite that's basically at the service either of those who want to exercise power or those who who can control the state by controlling the financial levers of the state. And de Maistre says, basically, there's only one real... If we're going to bring about some sort of reform, some sort of return to a conception of the human person and of the political order as logos drenched, and therefore capable of something good, we need the Pope to be the spiritual teacher and authority for Europe and the world. He has the only lawful authority that can help us understand not only nature, which is made by God, but also understand supernature and harmonize and guide both to achieve the common good.
Can you repeat that?
This is all the
So de Maistre basically says that Barruel has not gone far enough, that there are seeds that were planted beginning in the 13th and 14th century, and these seeds had a poor understanding of the human person, of the nature of society, economic life, political life. Those seeds have been born. They've borne fruit in the previous century and in the French Revolution. By the way, the 18th century was called the century of freedom, right? I mean, so people talk a lot about freedom now, freedom this, freedom that. I mean, the 18th century was called the century of freedom, where people were like maniacally concerned about freedom of all sorts of different forms. So we just shouldn't think like we're the first ones and we're unique, just because at the General Congress they asked the Father to think about freedom. Like nobody's done that before, right? I mean, I'm not opposed to anything they said in the General Congress, but I mean, sometimes people react to the letter and they're like, "Oh, look, they asked the Father to speak about freedom," and you get the sense that they're saying this like, well, no one's ever thought about this before, right? Like we're the first to like think, well, you got to think this through, right? That's all I'm saying. I'm just saying we're not the first to think it through.
They didn't seem to get it right, though.
Well, I mean, sometimes maybe.
1789, please.
No, clearly, no. But I mean, even at this point, I mean, Pope Pius VI, right before his death, he gives like reflection on the errors of freedom of the 18th century. Like we're not the first, even in the Catholic world, to think about this, right? I'm not saying it's not a problem and we shouldn't think about it. I'm just saying sometimes I see people react as if, like, you know, sometimes this has never been thought of before. Like we're the first. And I just, you know, just be humble. I mean, yes, we think about freedom, yes, but just be. Because sometimes we'll go talk with people and we'll say, you know, you don't know anything about freedom. I bet you never thought about it before, right? Now, if you actually know something, like you've read some Aquinas and you know something, you can do that, right? But if just because you think you've read like 2 paragraphs in a document and you think all of a sudden you're the expert on freedom, just be humble about it. That's all I'm saying, right?
Shut up, Sheely.
Sorry, guys.
I mean, you understand my point?
Yeah.
I'm just.
I don't know if Joe does.
So, what happens, interestingly enough, in Spain, in France, and in Italy, and actually, oftentimes this is also the initiative of lay people, right? Is that you start to see people who organize study circles.
Well, that was our idea.
You see this in Mainz, Germany, in Tübingen, in France, in Germany as well. You see it in certain parts of Spain, in France. I'm sure it also happens in Spain. There's a Russian princess who converts to Catholicism, and I forget now if it's in France or Germany. Princess Golitsyn, and she starts these salons, and the idea of these salons is to start to read and to read the fathers of the church and the great theologians like Aquinas in order to discover the dogmas of the past. Because basically the idea starts to become, well, we should study these dogmas, and they'll become seeds that we can replant in the soil, the intellectual climate, and they'll bear fruit probably in ways beyond what we realize now. Victor Hugo was in one of these circles, one of these study circles, but he left and became a naturalist in the 1820s. Just as for example. So a lot of times these study circles, they were fairly random what they would study, but the kind of the idea they tended to be romantic and even Catholic in their orientation at first. And there was no guide. I mean, it was just let's read this and let's read that, let's read something else. In Italy, one of the 2 figures from Italy that were in these study circles, one was a guy named Tapparelli. And Tapparelli goes on to become both a promoter of what becomes the Thomistic revival and also of Catholic social teaching in the 19th century. Another Italian that was in these study circles was Manzoni. For you literary aficionados out there, he goes on to write The Betrothed, right? The great Italian or Sicilian novel. At the time these study circles were in session, you wouldn't notice them even. But in a lot of these study circles, they kind of took the approach of Demestra. And they were involved in these study circles, oftentimes trying to understand contemporary problems, understand what are the innovations that are taking place in society, and what are the real solutions that are rooted in the truth and beauty and goodness. And when we'll take a 5-minute break here, and when we come back, we'll say more about the study circles.